It is Tuesday morning. The email has been sitting open in your browser for 40 minutes. You know exactly what you need to write. It is not a hard email. It will take maybe 8 minutes, and yet you cannot make yourself type the first word. So you switch tabs. You make another coffee. You reorganize something that did not need reorganizing. And somewhere in the background, a quiet voice tells you that you are lazy, that you do not care enough, that other people just do it. But here is what is actually happening. You are not being lazy. You are experiencing task paralysis, and it is one of the most misunderstood and most debilitating symptoms of ADHD. Task paralysis is not procrastination in the way most people think of it. It is not a choice to delay. It is a genuine neurological failure to initiate, where the brain gets stuck between knowing what to do and being able to make the body do it. It feels like your foot is pressing the accelerator and nothing is moving. The engine is running, the intention is there, but the signal between wanting to act and actually acting just does not fire the way it should. In this video, we are going to go all the way through it, the real science of why this happens, why the usual advice makes it worse, and specific strategies that are actually built for how your brain works, not inspiration, actual tools. Let's start with what is going on under the hood.
The ADHD brain is not a broken neurotypical brain. It is a brain that is wired differently at a very fundamental level, specifically in how it produces, transports, and uses dopamine. Dopamine is not just the pleasure chemical. That is an oversimplification that has caused a lot of confusion. Dopamine is actually your brain's signal for motivation, relevance, and initiation. It is the chemical that tells your brain, this matters, move toward it. Start now. In a neurotypical brain, the anticipation of completing a task, even a boring one, is usually enough dopamine signal to get things going. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, sequencing, and initiating action, gets the signal it needs and fires up. In an ADHD brain, dopamine signaling is chronically lower at baseline, and the receptors that receive it are fewer and less sensitive. So when you sit down to write that email, an email with no urgency, no novelty, no emotional charge, your prefrontal cortex simply does not get enough signal to activate. It is not a character flaw. It is closer to trying to start a car with a weak battery. The parts are all there, the knowledge of how to drive is all there, but the spark just will not catch. This is also why ADHD brains respond so strongly to deadlines, crisis, and high-interest tasks. Those things spike dopamine artificially. The brain finally gets enough signal to move. It is not that you can do it when you want to. It is that certain conditions create the neurochemical environment your brain needs to function. Understanding this completely changes how you approach the problem. Here's the part where most productivity advice completely falls apart for ADHD brains. The standard advice is, just start. Break it into smaller steps. Use a to-do list. Set a timer. And look, for a neurotypical brain dealing with mild resistance, that can work. But for an ADHD brain in the grip of genuine task paralysis, telling yourself to just start is like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. The instruction is not wrong in theory. The body simply cannot execute it right now. The problem is that willpower is a prefrontal cortex function, and the prefrontal cortex is exactly the region that is underactivated when dopamine signaling is low. So when you try to use willpower to override task paralysis, you are asking the very system that is offline to fix itself. It does not work. It will not work no matter how much you care, no matter how many consequences are on the line, and no matter how many motivational quotes you read. What you can do is change the neurochemical environment so that the prefrontal cortex gets enough signal to activate. That is the actual goal. Not discipline, not forcing, creating conditions. This is why some people with ADHD can hyperfocus for 6 hours on something they love and then cannot write one paragraph for work. Both involve effort, but one creates dopamine naturally and one does not. The strategy is not to become someone who loves every task. The strategy is to borrow dopamine from elsewhere and attach it to the task that needs doing. That is a completely different approach,
and it is one that actually works with your brain instead of against it.
There is a second layer to task paralysis that nobody talks about enough, and it makes everything significantly harder. It is the emotional component. Research on ADHD increasingly recognizes that emotional dysregulation is not a side effect, it is a core feature. ADHD brains feel things with much greater intensity than neurotypical brains, and they have less top-down regulation from the prefrontal cortex to buffer those feelings. So here is what happens in real life. You cannot start the task. You start feeling frustrated, then embarrassed. Then you start thinking about all the other times you could not start tasks. You remember the project you turned in late, the person you let down, the version of yourself you keep promising to become. And now you are not just paralyzed about the email, you are paralyzed and drowning in shame. And here's the cruel neuroscience of that. Shame and anxiety actually further suppress dopamine signaling. The stress response diverts resources away from the prefrontal cortex towards survival circuits. So the shame that comes from task paralysis actively deepens the paralysis. It is a loop, and it is not a moral failure that you fell into it. It was almost physiologically inevitable. This is why the first move is almost never tactical. Before any strategy works, you need to get out of the shame spiral. That means acknowledging what is happening without judgment, not toxic positivity, just accurate labeling. My brain is not releasing enough dopamine to initiate right now. That is a neurological event, not a verdict on who I am. That small reframe actually changes the emotional state, which changes the neurochemical environment, which makes the next step possible. Now, let's talk about what actually moves the needle and why each of these works at the neurological level, not just in theory. The first is the 1-minute rule, but not the way you have heard it before. Do not tell yourself you are going to work for 1 minute. That is still asking your brain to engage with the task. Instead, tell yourself you are going to be in the presence of the task for 1 minute. Open the document. Sit with it. Do not type. Just let your visual and working memory systems make contact with the material. Often, not always, but often, just making contact reduces the novelty gap and lowers the activation energy enough that the brain begins to engage. Second, stack a dopamine source onto the task. This is not cheating. This is neurochemistry. Put on a playlist you genuinely love. Make a specific drink you only have during work. Light a candle. These micro-rewards do not replace intrinsic motivation. They loan your brain enough dopamine to get the initiating circuits online. Third, use body doubling, which is working in the presence of another person or a virtual accountability partner. Research suggests that social proximity activates mirror neuron systems and also triggers a low-level social attention response, both of which can raise dopamine and norepinephrine enough to support focus and initiation. Study with me videos, virtual co-working rooms, and even a phone call you put on mute all count. Fourth, if the task feels overwhelming, do not break it into smaller steps. Break it into smaller sensory actions. Not write the intro, but type any sentence, even a bad one, and leave the cursor blinking. The brain needs emotion, not a milestone. These work because they are addressing the actual problem, creating enough neurochemical signal to fire the ignition. Here is what I want you to hold on to after this video. Task paralysis is not a personality trait. It is not evidence of laziness or low ambition or not caring enough. It is a predictable, documented, neurological consequence of how the ADHD brain manages dopamine and executive function. The email that sat open for 40 minutes, that was not failure. That was a brain without enough signal trying to do something it desperately wanted to do. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because the story you tell yourself about why you froze determines whether you can move forward or whether you spiral deeper. When you tell yourself you are broken, you stay stuck. When you understand what is actually happening, you can work with it. Not every day will be a breakthrough. Some days the strategies will not be enough, and that is real and valid too. ADHD is not something you optimize your way out of entirely. But you can get dramatically better at recognizing the freeze for what it is, interrupting the shame response before it takes over, and creating the conditions your brain actually needs to move. You already know how hard you have tried with the wrong tools. Imagine what becomes possible with the right ones. If this video helped you understand your brain even a little differently, that is exactly what this channel is here for.
We break down ADHD science into things you can actually use. No hype, no toxic positivity, just real answers for real brains. Follow for daily ADHD content. There's a lot more coming that I think is going to help.